So I guess we'll start by introducing, first of all, the seminar. So if you weren't able to attend before, well, I'm Jeff Haight. I'm one of the student reps for CAP LTER. And our student group decided to create this, get this seminar series going as a way of researchers just having a space to share social, ecological, and urban ecology research across our various units at ASU. And I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. David Proffitt. David holds a PhD in metropolitan planning, policy, and design from the University of Utah, and he's currently a postdoctoral researcher at ASU's Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation. And I have something in my eye. At the Wrigley Institute of Sustainability and Innovation, where he is assessing the implications of community co-produced visions for future urban development on climate change, transportation behavior, and governance institutions in metropolitan Phoenix. Take it away, David.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Whoever the host is, I need permission to share the screen.
Should be good.
Okay. Okay. Are we seeing the right thing? Good. All right. So yeah, my name's David, and I joined the CAP LTER this past summer, and I've been working on, as Jeff said, some of the implications for climate change mitigation from the scenarios. It's part of the scenarios team has produced over the past few years. And so what I want to talk about today is kind of how I give an urban planning perspective on how we look at and find ways to assess the potential for climate action plans, which essentially is what is we can kind of take out of these scenarios and how they can make a difference, and look ahead a little bit to some of the ways we can try to quantify some of those. So this will be some older work and just a little bit of a look ahead at current work. There we go. So as probably all of you know, the city of Phoenix is currently working on a climate action plan. The big overarching goal is for the city to be carbon neutral by 2060. They want to operate on 100% clean energy, and that's both city operations and all community-wide energy. I also want all new buildings to be net positive and for energy use by 2050. And then they've got some kind of interim goals that you can see per year over here in the bottom left. So interim targets to hit on the way to carbon neutral. And so this is, a pretty classic climate action plan, and studied these for a few years. And one of the big questions about climate action planning in general is whether it makes a difference, whether it can make a difference. And there are a couple of reasons for that. But I'll show you first this, the profile here. If you're trying to cut emissions, the main thing you should probably know is where your emissions are coming from. So these two charts compare the emissions profile for the United States as a whole here on the left, and for the city of Phoenix here on the right. These are compared proportionally by economic sector. Obviously, the total emissions from the nation as a whole are much, much larger than from the city of Phoenix. But the proportions of the emissions are different too. You can see that, agriculture, land use and forestry, pretty sizable proportion of national emissions as a whole. It's this light blue, and the darker blue, I'm sorry, the light blue is industry. The dark blue is the agriculture, land use and forestry. The light blue here is industry, about the same. Neither of these show up on the emissions inventory in Phoenix. In the case of the agriculture and forestry, not surprising, it's the difference between being a city and being, an entire country. But the other big differences are in transportation, electricity, and the fuel used on site at commercial and residential buildings. Thanks. Which is almost entirely natural gas burned for heating and water heating, space heating, etc. So pretty sizable proportion for or at least a significant proportion for the country as a whole. Very small for Phoenix. Don't use as much heating energy as perhaps the rest of the country. Let you figure out why. And that leaves almost all of Phoenix's emissions coming from electricity production, which is this purple here on the right or on the left, and transportation. And this breakdown, like I said, in part is the difference between being a city versus an entire country or an entire state with a lot more varied land use within it. But it also presents some kind of interesting opportunities and challenges when it comes to reducing these emissions. And that's primarily because if you're talking about a local government, local governments in the United States typically don't have a lot of control over the emissions that come from electricity production. They don't have the authority to regulate the utilities. They have some ability to set up purchasing renewable energy portfolios, but that's fairly limited. The power to regulate utilities rests with the federal and state governments. So if you're talking about a local climate action plan, even though this is a huge proportion of Phoenix's greenhouse gas emissions, there's only so much that they can do. It can affect the energy demand used for buildings and things like that, things on the demand side like that, but not a lot for direct emissions coming from power production. That leaves us with transportation. And that's where things get really interesting from kind of the local government perspective, because this is something that local governments can do something about. There are, and I'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, but basically there are kind of two sides to the transportation emissions coin. The first one are how much greenhouse gas emissions come from, say, from driving and transportation, and that depends on vehicle efficiency, how many miles per gallon your car gets. It also comes from the fuel mix and what type of fuel is being used, whether it's diesel, gasoline, aviation fuel, et cetera, and the specific composition of that fuel. A lot of you probably know that states like California and some other states in the Midwest have different regulations for the composition of vehicle fuels, whether it's adding ethanol or just low carbon fuels, like in states like California and other places that have adopted their standards. But statewide, they can control that. You can say you can sell gasoline with this type of formulation in our state. Sometimes it varies by season, et cetera. And that affects the amount of emissions that come from burning, say, a single gallon of gasoline. But once again, that's not something that local governments can do. So what local governments can do, though, is work on adjusting or reducing the demand for travel. And that's done by changing land use patterns within the city. Things are closer together. You can walk, you can take your bike, you can take transit. If you do drive, you drive less. And also the transportation infrastructure that is built. Obviously, if you have a better transit network, for example, you can have a greater proportion of people taking it and using it for a greater proportion of trips. It's more efficient from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint. So there we go. So the point that I'm making here is that transportation is not only a really big and important sector, accounts for a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions in Phoenix and in other cities and states across the country, but it's also something that can be controlled and definitely influenced by local governments. So I hope you can all still hear me. My computer just gave me a notice that it changed my microphone for some reason. It's good, okay. Not sure what's going on, but so anyway, so this is where, this is what some of my past work was on. We looked at laws in California and Oregon, which are leaders in climate action in the US. Most of the action on climate action in the United States has been at the subnational level for the past couple of decades, really, especially under Trump. Again, it's not a big secret why this is happening. We're back in the Paris Agreement now, but the United States is, but it's been happening in fits and starts at the national level. So states, cities, organizations have all been moving ahead over the past decade or two, and they've really been the pioneers. California and Oregon are two of the leaders among these subnational climate action planning efforts. So they both got statewide emissions reduction goals, 75% of 1990 levels in Oregon by 2050, 80% of 1990 levels by 2050 in California. And that's statewide, but as I was saying about the transportation, the same thing applies in California and Oregon. Oh, shoot. Anyway, my graph got messed up. But this purple one at the bottom here, this one that's really big, more than half of the California emissions, and this one that's supposed to be purple, but it's actually green, is about 50% of the emissions in Oregon are also from the transportation sector. So there's a big difference in the absolute amount of greenhouse gas emissions coming from those, just because California has 6-7 times the total emissions that Oregon does, but the proportions are very similar. And so when they were looking, when the state agencies in California and Oregon were looking at ways they can reduce their statewide emissions, they obviously looked at the transportation sector. California having kind of special dispensation from the EPA to set their own vehicle efficiency and fuel standards, did that and found that they could get the reductions from the transportation sector alone about 85% of the way to where they wanted to be to meet their overall statewide goals. Oregon adopted very, well, identical low carbon fuel standards and vehicle efficiency standards. That is an option in the United States that other states can do and adopt California standards. But they found that, they didn't get them all the way there. They couldn't reduce their emissions from the transportation sector the full amount that they wanted in either state, and left about 15% that they felt like they had to make up from VMT reduction, which is vehicle miles traveled. It's a measure of the amount an individual drives on average per day per year. So I'm going to say VMT a few more times. It's the amount people drive, the number of miles on average. And so they passed 2 more laws to support this overall statewide emissions reduction. In California, it's called the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act, primarily known as SB 375 after its Senate bill number. And Oregon developed the Sustainable Transportation Initiative, also known after one of the bills that makes up this law. It's SB 1059. These are the first laws anywhere in the country to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation by reducing overall levels of driving. So reducing VMT. And this is pretty interesting for a number of reasons. The way it works, or is trying to work, it addresses the way transportation planning happens in the United States. And that is itself kind of a long saga, but I'll summarize it. If there's kind of an original sin in American urban planning, it's that transportation planning and land use planning, as in what goes where, a house over here, a new subdivision here, businesses there, are not done by the same agencies. They're not done at the same scale, and they're not funded by the same people either. And that leaves them often in competition with one another. And so transportation planning is done at the regional scale, the metropolitan regional scale, primarily by kind of quasi-governmental agencies known as metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs. Here in Phoenix, it's MAG, Maricopa Association of Governments, which probably a lot of you have heard of. But there are about 400 of these all over the country, 400 of these MPOs. And so they plan transportation infrastructure investments across the metropolitan area, whereas land use is determined almost exclusively by municipal governments and counties, but local governments. And this authority over land use planning is very jealously guarded by municipal governments, because that allows them to do things like zone for large retail outlets and car dealerships and things that result in sales tax, other kinds of revenue garnering uses. And so a lot of times what's happened is that MPOs have taken a sort of predict and provide model for how they do land use planning. A city or a group of cities in a metropolitan area will all decide individually where they want to build new subdivisions, allow for new businesses to grow. And then the MPO will come in and work with a travel demand model and say, well, we think it'll be congested over here, so we're going to build a freeway, we're going to widen this road, and we're going to do that. You can probably imagine that this is very difficult to take into account, or at least to change or reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or even reduce the amount of driving. Since if you run a travel demand model that is designed to show you where places will be congested, almost the only answer you will get is that you need more roads. Also, the more roads you build, the more driving you get. So these laws, SB 375 and 1059, their goal is to kind of cut that knot and make a new relationship between MPOs and their constituent municipalities. And so what they do this by, here's this big orange ball. The state agencies set greenhouse gas reduction targets for each metropolitan area as a whole. And at least in the case of California and Oregon, those range from just a couple percentage point drops by 2025, to a couple of cases actually had some small increases, to about 20% a little more than 20% reductions. And so at that point, they have these mandates, and the MPOs are required to develop a scenario for future land use that allows them to then come up with supporting investments in transportation infrastructure that will reduce driving and reduce associated greenhouse gas emissions. This is where it gets interesting. Those plans and those scenarios are purely for analytical purposes. They're designed to be inputs into these travel demand models. So they show, like, okay, if we build, subdivision goes here, businesses go there, we put in more transit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, fewer highways, then we will have less driving, we will have less emissions, we will meet our target. Great. All we have to do is for all the cities to agree that they're going to follow this scenario, this land use scenario, and everything will be good, except they don't have to. The municipalities don't have to follow the scenarios at all. There are some inducements that they do so, and mostly those are in the form of spending on transportation projects, which might not be authorized and might not go forward if they don't follow this regional transportation plan that now includes this climate action portion and these development scenarios that will reduce driving. But they are voluntary plans, so they rely on influence. And again, if all goes well, the cities follow the scenarios. Excuse me. They build more compact development, and then the transportation infrastructure develops differently. People then respond to the changes in infrastructure in the built environment. They drive less. Vehicle miles traveled are reduced, then greenhouse gases are reduced, and we get this nice virtuous cycle instead of the vicious cycle that reinforced more and more automobile dependence and more driving. So the question is, like with all climate action planning efforts, does this work? And how can we tell? So we looked at a couple of interim things to tell. I mean, the way the built environment develops takes decades. So ultimately we'll know in about 30 years if these laws work. But in the meantime, looked at kind of 3 different areas. Looked at planning documents, spending priorities set by the MPOs as far as what kinds of transportation projects they're going to build, and talked to planners at MPOs about how the whole process of creating these scenarios and the regional transportation plans that they're part of, how that changed. All of these take a kind of before and after quasi-experimental approach. The first one, I looked at content analysis, so the plans produced before the laws went into effect versus the plans produced afterward, and spending priorities before and after, and then talking to planners about how the process of creating these plans changed when they had to create the scenarios and what the landscape looked like afterward. So I'll just summarize some of the results. There are 18 MPOs in California and 6 in Oregon that were subject to these laws. So those are the largest cities in both states. They're not big cities in all cases, but in almost every case, you can see the blue lines are the before plan and the red lines are the after plan. This is the measuring how the quality of the climate action portions of the planning documents changed from before and after implementation of these laws. So that the content analysis looked at things like, whether the plans talked about climate change and how they talked about it, what kinds of analytical processes and models they used to determine greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, vulnerability to climate change, various populations and locations, And then most importantly, the kinds of goals and programs and policies that were put in place specifically to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from driving. This is all, the plan quality is kind of a term of art within urban planning to describe plans just like this. And the idea is that, especially in the case where, like regional transportation plans, where the municipalities or the entities subject to the plan are not required to follow it for legally, the plan relies on its ability to influence their decision. So the idea is that the way you influence decisions more and get more implementation, more complete implementation of your plan, is to come up with a better plan, right? You make it clearer, you make it more compelling, you make the incentives and the reasons that the municipalities in this case should follow your plan. You make that clearer, and you dangle the carrots, emphasize that. And so this shows that the quality of the climate action planning portions of these regional transportation plans improved in almost every case. Couple of exceptions being San Francisco, Stockton, and Salem. There's one more, but I'm missing it. Anyway, spoiler alert, San Francisco basically got a lower score, kind of as a relic of the content analysis process. They just didn't mention the phrase climate change in their after plan, but they said afterward that that's just because they said, well, everyone kind of agrees with this and they know it, and we just didn't put it in. Oh well. So, not the case with some of the Central Valley cities in California and Salem in Oregon, but that's a longer story for another time. So okay, so we see that the document's changed. That's great. So hopefully they're clearer, a little more compelling, trying to get the cities on their side to agree and to really have a stronger commitment to taking climate action as part of these plans. The next thing that we can use to look at to see how these laws made a difference was looking at the transportation improvement programs. And this is a kind of a subsidiary document to the regional transportation plans. So the regional transportation plans are long-term documents. They look out 20 to 30 years into the future and really try to set the vision for what the metropolitan region is going to look like, what its transportation network will look like decades into the future. The transportation improvement programs, or TIPs, are kind of the opposite. They are short-term budget recitations of budget priorities that look out over a 2 to 4 year time horizon. They have to be updated every 2 years, and they have to be consistent with the regional transportation plan. So this is where the regional transportation plan really has, if it has any teeth at all, this is where it has them. Because these TIPs have to be consistent with them. And the TIPs are, you don't get federal funding at all unless you have a current and well laid out TIP that's filed with the US Department of Transportation. And this ties all the projects to actual existing sources of funding. So this is kind of where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Looking at the TIPs, categorized all the projects in them, which can vary from a few dozen to several thousand, like in the case of Los Angeles, into 4 categories. And the first one are bike ped projects, bicycle and pedestrian projects. And the next one are roadway capacity projects, and that means anytime you expand the capacity of a roadway, so you build a new highway, you add a lane to an arterial street, or you do something so that more vehicles can go down a road. That's a roadway capacity project. We have operations and maintenance projects and transit projects. So if these laws are having the effect that we expect, prediction is that spending on bicycle and pedestrian projects as a proportion of the total budget in this individual tip would go up. That spending on roadway capacity projects would go down. Spending on operations and maintenance would be maybe go up, maybe go down, maybe about the same, hard to say. And that spending on transit would go up, because these are all, roadway capacity projects will encourage driving and VMT and greenhouse gases. Bike ped and transit projects will obviously decrease VMT and driving. And you want to keep things from falling apart. So operations and maintenance are kind of about the same. Turns out this is roughly what happened. The median change as a proportion of the total budget went up just a little bit. Spending on bike ped projects went up just a little bit in both California and Oregon. It went down a significant amount in both states. Operations and maintenance spending went down in California, went up in Oregon, but again, it's about what we expect. And then kind of the counterintuitive one, spending on transit went up pretty significant amount in California and down in Oregon. And I should say, I'm using the word significant, that the changes are statistically significant. I was referring to the magnitude in this case. So taking a look at the individual metropolitan areas, you can see kind of how this happened. There are, first of all, just fewer metros and MPOs in Oregon. So like this big jump in roadway capacity spending in Corvallis, they had a big highway project that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on. So that kind of blew out the budget for that year's tip. And then correspondingly, they had less spending on both bike ped and operations and maintenance, and had a big actual drop in spending on transit. And kind of opposite side of the coin, in one of the big jumps in California, it's a lot more regular looking in general than Oregon, but one of the big jumps is Santa Barbara. They had a big jump in transit spending, but a correspondingly pretty big drop in roadway capacity spending. And that's kind of how we see that work, where the budgets change from tip period to tip period, but overall there's a limited amount of the pie that they can divvy up here. So if you see a big jump in one category, it's got to come from the other categories by and large. And so that's what we saw. The third thing was really, if we saw the effects of these scenarios and the mandate to create these coordinated land use and transportation scenarios as influencing planning documents and planning spending priorities on transportation infrastructure. Talked to some planners to ask why. Did kind of a cross-case comparison to come up with a synthetic case study, doing semi-structured interviews with planners at various agencies in both states. And the kind of 40,000 foot view, one of the single most common things I heard as far as the barriers to creating a good scenario, having the process go well, where the municipalities were on board and committed to it. One of the biggest things that they needed is, they said over and over again, we still don't have any authority over land use. Municipalities don't have to listen to us, except for Portland, which is through a whole series of strange turns in history, probably the only true regional government in America. But just when it comes to transportation planning, Portland is the exception in almost every case. So just know that. But that doesn't exist anywhere else. Not only in California and Oregon, but almost anywhere else in the country. So, and they struggled. They needed to, in a lot of cases, they struggled to get this influence. They didn't have the levers that they felt like they needed to really shift decisions at the local level. Partly because so much of the main inducement that they have is funding and money. So they can spend hundreds of millions of dollars or just a few $1 million on projects in a given city or not. And the problem is that MPOs don't have total control over the money, even in their own budgets. A lot of the funding programs have some pretty significant strings attached. They can get money from the federal government or state governments, but a good chunk of the time it can only be used for very specific types of projects. Highway safety, for instance, is a big one. Expanding roadway capacity, relieving congestion, that kind of thing. So it's not like even the places with really big budgets don't have a lot of discretion over how they spend a lot of that money. And so that made it really hard to convince the municipalities that they needed to change anything, because they said, well, if it doesn't come with more money, we just don't have time to do it. Another interesting barrier was that there was a lot of mistrust of the state governments, both from the MPOs and the local governments, but mostly from the local governments. A lot of the planners described the situation where they'd go in and they would have meetings with the municipal level officials, and they'd say, okay, so here's this great land use scenario, and here's the corresponding transportation network that goes with it. What we're going to do, here's what we want to do, and they'd say, well, that's great. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions too, but we're afraid that if we agree to this, that the state is going to make us do it and require us to do it. So some of them, actually, that was their reason to come and participate in the process at all, because they said, well, we don't want it to be too awful if you're gonna do that. So we're here to essentially put the brakes on the process and keep you from doing very much. But whereas others in other municipalities, they got pretty excited and they're like, yeah, we could do a lot more, but if we put this scenario out there and make this scenario part of our plan officially, we don't want the state to come along later and say we have to do this because it's too ambitious. So there was some frustration there. On the other hand, where the MPOs had a lot of success in kind of bringing along the municipalities and influencing their decisions was when they were seen as honest brokers. And this was essentially the MPOs taking on a consulting role. They had a lot of technical capacity that the local governments didn't often have, as far as the ability to model and quantify future transportation patterns, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. In one case, there was a city that had put together their own climate action plan that depended a lot on reducing emissions from transportation within the city. And the MPO did their analysis and compared that to the scenario that they were putting together, and kind of had to break the news to the city that all of the work they'd done on their climate action plan was kind of moot because it wasn't going to get them anywhere near where they wanted to be. They'd set pretty ambitious goals and just didn't have the policies to support it. So that was sad news for the municipality, and they kind of had to go back to the drawing board. But you could also see that as a good thing. At least they knew that was going to happen going in. The other big thing was that just introducing climate change at all and reducing GHGs into the conversation was kind of a new thing. Often the two sides, the MPO planners and the local government planners, had just assumed that they wouldn't find willing partners on the other side. That they were, them and their little group of people at whatever agency they were at were the only ones who were interested. And then when they were told they had to sit down and talk about this, they often found that they had a lot more in common than they expected. And so that really changed the conversation and launched new networks and new levels of communication in a lot of cases. So the mandate to create these scenarios did affect the plans, did affect spending priorities, and decisions, and it affected the process. Whoops. But what does that mean for Phoenix? Well, there are a couple of lessons that we can draw here. Number one, the Phoenix being a large, very fast-growing place means that there is more capacity for change. And explain that. This is something that found in a lot of the cases in California and Oregon, where places that grew more slowly or were shrinking or were smaller and just didn't have much of a budget to change very much in the as far as their transportation infrastructure goes. There wasn't very much that they could change. The whole system wasn't changing very much. So their commitment to climate action was not quite immaterial, but it was a really big hurdle to overcome, just this lack of capacity to change their transportation network and infrastructure. That is not the case in Phoenix. Obviously, very large metro, large city by itself, and growing among the fastest growing metros in the country. And as far as the other part, the commitment, the city recently joined C40 cities. So even though this 0.3 here, Arizona in years past had been kind of a climate leader at the state level, setting up greenhouse gas reduction goals, even trying to set up a cap and trade system, an interstate cap and trade system that at one point was going to include Mexico and Canada. Well, Great Recession happened, administration change in state government, and now Arizona is a climate laggard. But there is a legacy there. So Phoenix is trying to charge ahead in the face of kind of a currently hostile state government environment, but who knows what will happen there. So what this means for the scenarios, and I'll go through this really quickly. As you all probably know, or maybe not, the scenarios team, as part of CAP LTER, has put together a whole series of regional and neighborhood scenarios that envision what the Phoenix region might look like in 2060. And just to highlight a couple, they all have names. There's one that aims to deal with drought. It's an adaptive scenario, and it has a lot of water banking projects and things like that that have been suggested by the community members who took part in the workshops that co-produced these scenarios. And the emphasis is really on finding ways that the region can deal with drought and water shortages in the future. By contrast, another scenario, it's less focus on a single problem like drought, but more just how could the city transform itself to become more livable and a better place for everyone. Has the name the Emerald City. that it relies a lot on urban ecological infrastructure to handle flooding, but also to mitigate heat and drought. And the thing about all of these scenarios is that the strategies that are included in them, that are suggested as part of them, were not suggested in order to mitigate climate change at all, but they do have a lot of potential to affect climate change. Classified, there's about 550 separate strategies that were mentioned in the set of scenarios. There's a lot of overlap by scenario, but could see that this dark blue color here are strategies that have to do with transportation. So not totally surprisingly, the regional scenarios that look at the entire metropolitan region have a much bigger focus on transportation than the neighborhood scale scenarios, which were envisioned for South Phoenix. Some of them, the one called Connected and Mobile that focuses on transportation does have a pretty sizable number of strategies in it that do affect transportation, but the others not so much. So what I'm doing is looking at how, trying to quantify some of the potential effects of enacting these strategies so that we can look at the different scenarios and say, well, this one could potentially reduce greenhouse gas emissions from either scenarios or from transportation and other sectors by X amount, and really determine which might be the best way to go for the city as a whole. So I think that went a little long, but there we go. Welcome any questions or comments or wondering thoughts.
Got several minutes, so oh yeah.
Or we could all go have a cocktail.
Yes, Dan.
Yeah, Dan.
Nice talk, David. I was a little curious about how you come into the light and then you completely become a black silhouette and then you come into the light. How are you pulling that off?
I'm extremely backlit. My living room has very large windows in it.
Oh,
This is not my living room you see behind me. But
I was going to say it's rather palatial. I do see a lot of windows.
Yeah.
But I do have a question. And this is probably a question just to give you a chance to conjecture a little bit. But in the latest pandemic relief bill, there's a huge chunk of money coming to state and local governments. What do you think might be the impact of that unexpected infusion of federal investment in what states in general, or Arizona in particular, and in particular some of our cities, Phoenix, might do with some of these bold plans?
yeah, I mean, well, there's a lot of talk about, how much Amtrak Joe might fund things like HighSpeed Rail, other transportation projects like that. So, and if you're talking about California, for instance, this could rescue the state's whole high-speed rail project, which has, let's put it kindly and say, stalled over the past few years. But if that continues, and there is actually a true high-speed rail link between San Francisco and Los Angeles as is envisioned, that's a complete game changer for not just for California, but in a lot of ways for the country, because a lot of the emissions that would be avoided aren't just driving. Some of the biggest supporters, surprisingly, of high-speed rail projects like that have been airports, especially airports in large urban areas that face expansion constraints, and they make their money. They get paid by how many passengers come in and out. And they can be a lot more efficient serving big airplanes with more passengers. They're serving long haul routes, several hundred people coming in from across in a transoceanic flight versus a few dozen people flying to Fresno. And so they still need the same runway space and the same, air traffic control towers, but they make a lot more money per flight from the big ones. So this applies to Phoenix as well. It's the largest city in the country without a rail link of any kind, or an intercity rail link. And it doesn't seem like ADOT has anything shovel ready right now, but could fund stuff like that. And if it does, that'd be great.
I have a question. Thank you, David, for a nice presentation. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how you can apply some of the analyses you were talking about in California and Oregon to what you've started here with our CAP scenarios, and especially thinking about potential cost of some of these strategies, which is something you talked about quite a bit in your previous work.
Yeah, the cost of the project is kind of a dicey thing to try to take from something like the scenarios that we've got here in Phoenix, just because it is so project specific. But I think what is possible is to come up with at least a quantifiable range, that's something that's fairly reasonable for the potential to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Because there are a lot of empirical studies out there that have looked at the impact of, what happens if you improve transit by such and such amount? What happens if you produce better biking and walking infrastructure? So there's empirical evidence that suggests at least a range, a rough estimate of how much that might reduce driving in VMT. Because it all comes down to human behavior in most cases. So we don't ask any economist, right? You can't totally predict what people are going to do, but you can have an idea at least.
Yeah, I think you framed it better than I did. I guess I didn't necessarily mean the cost of the project itself, but the implications in terms of the outcomes.
Yeah, and so that would be, yeah, that's the goal. Well, when it comes to climate action planning, there are a lot of different approaches to quantifying the various strategies, but there's not really a single standardized approach. So C40 cities, for instance, which I mentioned Phoenix joined, has kind of a spreadsheet model that you can use when preparing a climate action plan. And they encourage the cities and the city governments to put the results of their greenhouse gas inventory in that model, and then you can go several steps on over the multiple sheets over their model to at least get an idea of how some of those actions might pay off in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. And then they can do you have to input a lot of parameters, but you can get some ideas about the implementability and feasibility of implementation of various actions. But a lot of these are pretty cumbersome, and I'm not saying that this isn't, specifically with transportation, but because transportation is kind of a unique beast when it comes to how it's planned and implemented, determining the potential reductions in greenhouse gas emissions is, I think a little more feasible than some other sectors. So I hope so anyway.
All right, so we're at 4 o'clock now, so if people got to go, that's all good. But let's give Dave one last round of applause.
Well, thanks for sticking with me.
Yeah, great talk.
Thanks for speaking with us.
All right. Have a good afternoon, folks. Bye-bye.
Good weekends, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it.